Hello and welcome to another episode of the Chronicles of Chase. Today we have part 7 and the finale. Yes, you heard it right. The finale of Naltithconet today. Before we get into the story, I'd just like to say a quick shout out and thank you to Craig, the fictional protagonist of this story. Not easy to go first, someone had to do it. Just a quick shout out to the big dog, fictional Craig, for stepping into that position. Anyway, without further ado, I don't believe we should delay it anymore. I give you Naltithconet, Part 7, the finale. Water splashes into Craig's face, running down his scraggly beard, onto his neck and into the rough fabric of the jumpsuit they had outfitted him with. He opens his eyes, the rivulets of water blurring his vision, as he looks up at the same stern-looking naval officer he has been talking with over the last few weeks, or at least one of the two. The fluorescent lights above him were knifing sharp beams of light into his naked mole-rat pupils. It had been 3 weeks since Craig had seen the sun, or at least he thought it had been. Without sunrise and sunset, it was hard to keep track. He sees the blur of a shirt cuff approaching rapidly out of the corner of his squinted eyes. He tries to dodge it, to reach his hands up and shield his face, but the shackles that chain him to the table stop his wrist short. The backhand of the officer sails cleanly through his cheek, torquing his neck and face off to the left. "Now, I'm going to ask you again, Craig Lawrence Washington III, the gruff man says, leaning over Craig and rocketing spittle into his face as he asks the question. What the fuck did you throw in the water? You already know this. Why are you asking me the same questions? Craig starts, tired, unsure of where these circles he and his interrogators had been going in were going to. Hadn't he told them the truth? Hasn't it been 3 weeks? You don't have any divers? Can't they find the stone? He ventures. The hand comes again, sweeping across his other cheek and twisting his face back to the left. Cracks across his face hurt, surely, but mostly his pride. He could tell they were holding back, but they didn't want to actually hurt him. Shit, he wasn't even aware that you could be detained at the Naval Academy until a couple of weeks ago. Surely, they weren't allowed to actually torture people down here, even if they were allowed to hold them. I'm the one asking the questions. How dare you ask about divers? Now, what did you throw in the water? The officer yells, the spittle coming again like a torrential rain. And don't give me any crap about stones or goddesses. Craig dangles his face into his hands, wipes it clean, then raises it again to face the officer. But it was a stone, Craig says sheepishly. The officer's cheek twitches, his brow furrowing in fear. What do you mean, it was a stone? Craig's interrogator, Officer Corwin, says with icy coolness, staring daggers into his face. I mean, well, it's exactly like I've been saying, sir. It was a stone that I threw into the water. A stone from the goddess, like you just said. Craig watches the officer as he scans Craig from head to toe, anxiety running rife below the surface of the poker face of bravado he tries so hard to keep intact, before rising and walking out of the room. Craig watches the heavy steel door that is slammed shut behind him, chanting the mantra of the goddess's names along with the serpents under his breath. After a few minutes, another officer, a middle-aged woman, enters the room. She is short, barely clearing 5 feet, and Craig had come to know her over the last couple of weeks as the Naval Academy's good cop interrogator. She almost always followed Officer Corwin. Her sight had a Pavlovian pairing in his mind with a smarting cheek, a damp collar, and a slight headache. He wasn't even sure at times what Officer Corwin's job was, other than to yell, scream, and get Craig woken up and ready to be interrogated by Officer Marshall. The mantra on his lips dies down as soon as the door opens. Officer Marshall makes her way to the metal chair, dragging its feet on the concrete as she pulls it out and sits down. So, Craig, she begins casually, we've already been through this, and to be honest, Officer Corwin and myself are just having a hard time believing a single word of what you're saying. It honestly sounds like you're high on some kind of controlled substance hearing this stuff. But we know that can't be, since you've been here under our watchful care for so long. She stops here, reaching out and grabbing her coffee cup. She takes a sip while she looks Craig up and down, slightly incredulously. Let's start with these names you were chanting again. That was Sedna, Adabe, Guabanses, Chalchiwatikwe, Tone Nali'i, and Untunktahe? And Unkula? Did I get those right? Craig nods as she continues, realizing she probably wasn't asking for pronunciation notes. So, who are they again? Take me through it like it's the first time. You already know, though, Craig says with a sigh, sitting forward in his seat. They are the names of the goddess who sent me. Well, all but Unkula. That is her serpent. Okay. And where did you meet this goddess? Officer Marshall asks, clearly amused. At the bottom of the Chesapeake Bay, near the husk of the Francis Scott Key Bridge. And how does that work? A meeting at the bottom of the bay? I've been at the academy a long time. I've swum and fallen in the bay, but I can't remember ever meeting at the bottom of it. Did you have diving gear? No. You know all this, Officer Marshall. I don't know why you're asking me to repeat myself so many times. When will I be free to go? Please, Craig, let's remain focused. I need to hear it all again. I believe you're explaining how you met at the bottom of the Chesapeake Bay. Craig stares with white-hot fury over the table. How many times had he asked when he would be free to leave? How many times had they refused to answer his question? Okay, he musters through gritted teeth. An air bubble somehow appeared around my head. My body did not enjoy the same treatment. Ah, cold, Officer Marshall says with a small smile. Were military interrogators allowed to have this much fun with the interviews? Craig wonders. And why did this goddess, this supreme being, and her serpent companion call upon you at the bottom of the Chesapeake? What did they ask you to do? She continues. Well, she entrusted me with 13 Sawul stones. I was to perform a ceremony at each tributary of the Chesapeake, then cast the stone into the delta at the end. Craig continues, explaining the particulars of the story, and the fact that the last stone had been cast into the bay right before he was apprehended at his tour's conclusion. Officer Marshall nods along as he finishes up, almost as if he had told her any old slice-of-life story. He doesn't know how many times he'd repeated these details, bringing Officer Marshall through the beats 10 times, 15. Never Officer Corwin, though. He was honestly at a loss to what the brute's function could possibly be. Either he was the best and most outlandish liar to ever walk the earth, or he was telling the truth. Either way, he couldn't tell how slapping Craig silly was going to change that fact. Officer Marshall glances over her shoulder, back towards the two-way mirror that paneled the far wall. Craig's eyes follow, though he is met with his own gaze staring right back at him. His face looks bedraggled, his beard uneven and scraggly. His eyes scan the space around his face wildly, trying not to settle on themselves. Their crazed, caged look feels so unfamiliar to him that he can barely believe they are his, though they sit within his half-deranged countenance. Craig turns back towards Officer Marshall as she pivots as well. She places her hand on her earpiece and asks, "Are you sure?" before bringing her gaze back to Craig's, sighing and saying, "Okay." Her shoulders shrug, and Craig watches, his cheek twitching under the stress. I don't believe a damn word you're saying, and I'm against sharing any information whatsoever with you. You've asked repeatedly when you will be released, where your lawyers are, why you haven't been read your rights and taken to a standard holding facility. We haven't answered these questions because we don't have to. Changes to national policy nearly 5 years ago stripped all domestic and international terrorists of any rights they may have within U.S. military property. Whoa, terrorist? I'm no terrorist, Craig exclaims, interrupting Officer Marshall and bringing her right hand sternly into the air. Craig shuts up, a chill running through his body. That is exactly what you are, Officer Marshall begins again through gritted teeth as she lowers her hand. You are a terrorist who carried out an attack on our U.S. Naval Academy's base just 3 weeks ago. You are a habitual liar who, though consistent in his fairy tales, has yet to tell us the true motive, tools, or organization behind said attack. You are an enemy of the state. A barely audible buzz comes from Officer Marshall's earpiece. She pauses, grimaces. You are all of this, which is why I am against sharing any information with you. However, her eyes scan him up and down again, her knuckles draining of blood as her grip bears down on itself. Myself, Officer Corwin, and many others who have the security clearance to know the facts of your interrogation believe you in one very small matter. Another pause, a sigh. Over the course of the last 3 weeks, 64 of the 66 nuclear submarines in the United States Armada were compromised. Onboard data shows some kind of aggressive, almost predatorial vines rising from the deep seas. Within minutes of contact with these vines, the submarines were ensnared completely. Pressure built on the hulls to the point of implosion. She stops, shakes her head, passes her hand over her cheek, rubbing down her jaw. The stress in the room is palpable. Craig squirms in his seat. He had been far more afraid of this quiet intensity than the brazen meathead beatings from Officer Corwin, and he had never felt so much rage coming from Officer Marshall's body. Every scientific calculation we had, all the data, said those crews were lost. The only reason the 2 submarines we saved weren't sunk was because they got to bases. And not only that, plenty got to bases after it started happening. Almost 20. The vines were everywhere in the ocean, though. The water outside, fucking choked and clogged. Any ship bigger than a little fishing vessel has been snagged. The 2 submarines that were saved, you ask? Any naval equipment at all? Dry docks. They're the only thing that was able to salvage anything, and we don't know what for. Will we ever be able to sail again? The people of the world are asking. The look of fire in Officer Marshall's eyes has not dimmed a bit, and her gaze has been trained directly on Craig, blazing a hole in his forehead through him down to his feet. He can feel the anger, confusion, and frustration of sailors everywhere bearing down on him through her. But he'll be damned if she was going to guilt him over some damn nuclear submarines. His heart had leaped with joy when she had said that. He hadn't known the number to be 66 until she said it. Didn't know shit about how many nuclear submarines there were in the world. But damn it if he didn't hope and pray that every one of them had been sunk. Save the 2, of course. Sedna, Arabe, Kawana, Guabanses, Chalchiwatikwe, Tone Nali'i, Untungtahe, he thinks to himself, trying to focus any intention he can outwards to this clearly actionable goddess. Anyway, the part of your story that we believe. About a week after the first nuclear submarine went down, out in the Indian Ocean, its crew started coming ashore. Thailand, Myanmar, Malaysia, all of them telling the same story. Now these are sworn officers and sailors of the United States Navy, some nuclear scientists, of course. All that to say, not terrorists like yourself. And yet, they all tell of an air bubble around their head alone, a rush towards the surface like your exit from this fabled meeting with this goddess. Most of these men came from depths that should have crushed them. Even freediving record holders couldn't have made the swim back to the surface. Pressure be damned. But here they were, here they are. 95% survival rate so far on the 64 downed subs. She stops, shakes her head, scoffs. Her hand goes to the back of her neck, rubbing at some mystery knots beneath her neat military hair. But if you believe that, Craig begins, incredulous at the revelation. The goddess had spared the crews, thank God. Thank Sedna, Adabe, Kawana, Guabanses, Chalchiwatikwe, Tone Nali'i, Untungtahe. What are you trying to say? She says, an edge in her voice. You've seen these men, though? Talked to them? And you believe them? How much further of a leap could it be to believe me? I guess is all I'm saying. He trails off. The edge in her voice had kept him from noticing, but he now sees the anger has faded from her eyes in large part. They have softened far past any point he has seen in Officer Marshall's countenance in all of their talks. was now dominated by a look of what? Sadness? Pity? We cannot. You ask us to believe you had a conference with the deity who gave you a terrorist mission that has absolutely decimated our nuclear fleet. She laughs, shakes her head once again. Maybe that's where the crick in her neck is coming from, he thinks. Even if we do believe the whole goddess Stone foolishness, the fact still remains. You've carried out an act of terror against the United States of America, and you have lied to us. As such, you will not be seeing a free day for the rest of your life, Craig. They'll be preparing you for a transfer tomorrow, and a tribunal shortly thereafter. She rises from her seat, making it scrape on the concrete once again. The pity in her eyes intensifies, and her bottom lip seems to push up into the top. You've done this to yourself. If you would just tell the truth about what you did, why you did it, we might still be able to do something to help you. Her eyebrows raise expectantly, looking back down at Craig. I promise I am telling you the truth, Officer Marshall, he says, looking back up at her with resignation. Her brows fall, her face filling with some unknown emotion as she turns towards the door. Craig begins muttering the names under his breath once again as the door clicks shut. He continues the mantra throughout the night and into the next day as he is loaded into a van and driven for days and days. The various guards in his transit intermittently try to stop him, try to beat the names from his lips, but he continues on and on and on. They arrive in the desert, and Craig is placed in a barrack-style brig, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. The tribunal happens just as Officer Marshall predicted it would, with all the expediency one would expect. The names don't leave his lips until he is gagged. Even then, they remain in his mind. Judgment is passed, a life sentence, and Craig is shepherded back to his cell. For years he is denied entertainment. Her names remain on his lips and in his mind still. Some days, he feels as if he is becoming illiterate, unable to speak anything other than her names. These days he has to force himself to recount his life before imprisonment, the scenery around him, deathly afraid of becoming a babbling madman. After a few days of this, though, Craig gets paranoid, worrying about the goddess's demands to be acknowledged. And so the names return. After a few years, he is allowed 1 hour of television a day. In these daily glimpses, he sees her deeds. Coral reefs return in a strength unseen by cameras and film, having been overfished beyond that point well before the invention came along. Fishing becomes one of the biggest local industries in the world once again. Humans didn't take long to figure out the rules of the kelp. Small vessels, no bottom trawlers, and no large, organized corporate ventures. It was still something of a mystery to humans how the plant life had the intelligence to recognize this last category of fishing. Idiots thought it was logos that got the ships attacked. Scientists posited that it was the organized release in a large-scale way from any fishing spot. But many ventures had tried sporadic fishing times, launch points, damn near everything. It seemed that independent fishermen were safe, and the corporations that had fished the sea for so long were simply unwelcome. Trash islands and oil rigs had been taken under much like the nuclear submarines, aircraft carriers, and other ships of war. The oceans had begun cooling, and many ecosystems on shorelines had returned, some in quite invasive ways, on the million-dollar properties that had displaced them. Craig sometimes had to watch 2 or 3 days of the news before another nugget about the sea would come through, especially as the days bled into the years, and the years bled into decades. The world began taking the clean, slightly unwelcoming sea as a given, and humans continued finding ways to pollute that weren't water-based. Supersonic jet travel had increased dramatically, as well as freighter planes, big lumbering things that flew low and slow over the clean water of the ocean, belching toxic gas. Craig never had to wait much longer than 2 or 3 days, though, and then the dazzling, clear blue sea would be back on the screen. Some schmuck who had never known it to be anything else talking about how it was flourishing, like usual. The goddess's names remained on Craig's lips, and he knew if he was ever released from this desert cage, so far from her shores, that he would make a sojourn back to her. he would sail out to the middle of the Chesapeake and beg entrance into Naltithconet. All right, folks, that does it. With that final 7th edition, we are finished with the story of Naltithconet and on to the next one. Please be on the lookout for the second short story time, probably releasing midweek this next week, and then the first installment of our next series, Outpost 19. Thank you so much for listening, and please like and subscribe if you liked what you heard.